There are things we never say, conversation we rehearse years too late, words we carry quietly like folded letters waiting for a place to land. If I Could Say One More Thing is a podcast about those moments, the ones that linger, the ones that ache, the ones that never quite end. Each episode begins with a real what if, a story imagined not to change the past, but to understand it. I'm Andrea Applewick, and this is If I Could Say One More Thing. Some stories don't ask to be finished. They simply want to be remembered. Gently, honestly, without urgency. Today's episode is about timing, about a promise made lightly and carried quietly for decades, about the people who shape us not by staying, but by showing us how to move through the world with care. This is a story set in spring, not because everything begins again, but because something softens enough to be seen. This is the spring I returned to myself. If you had asked me at 26 what I expected my life would look like at 52, I would have said something impressively naive like, "Oh, I'll be settled by then," which is charming in the way toddlers announce they'll be astronauts after lunch. At 52, here is what I had actually settled. My daughter was in Edinburgh, studying psychology to better understand her mother, which I suspected meant me. My ex-husband was in Tenerife with a woman who believed every meal, sunset, and furniture purchase was a journey. And I was in Bath, stirring a cup of tea that had long accepted its fate. It was early spring, the kind where the light appears cautiously, like someone testing the temperature of the room. A bird outside chirped with ridiculous enthusiasm. That's when my email arrived. Your booking is confirmed. Bologna, April 3rd to the 6th. Apparently, I had booked a spontaneous Easter weekend in Italy. A February decision, clearly. February pressures you into emotional bankruptcy. I had lived in Bologna briefly in 1999 during a semester studying botanical illustration. Back when I was 26 and still believed that a pencil and a well-timed metaphor could fix my life. That was where I met Matteo. We crossed paths in the Orto Botanico on a warm Tuesday when the world smelled faintly of ambition and soil. I had been sketching a row of terracotta pots when I bumped one with my elbow. "Oh, sorry," I muttered to the pot, then mortifyingly to the leaf I had brushed. Matteo, kneeling nearby, looked up, his eyes lit with the delighted amusement of someone who had just observed a rare, enduring creature. "Don't worry," he said in lightly accented English. "The plant forgives you." Later, he would tell me the apology gave me away. "Only English people say sorry to pottery," he said, "and to leaves, and to weather." From that moment on, We were quietly inseparable, not as lovers or even declared friends, just two people orbiting each other's peculiarities. Mateo was studying ecology. He moved through the garden with the reverent competence of someone on visiting terms with the plants. He introduced me to weeds by their Latin names. Galisogna ispida, he would say, tapping a leaf. Then in English, very ambitious weed. Wants to be a tree one day. I followed him everywhere with my sketchbook, pretending to study plant anatomy while mostly studying him. He didn't seem to notice my sketches until the afternoon he did. We were sitting beneath a small fig sapling he had planted earlier that spring. It's young now, he said, brushing one of its leaves. Figs grow with determination. While he talked, I sketched the curve of his hand, the tendons rising delicately when he touched a stem, the faint soil in his nail beds, the gentleness in every movement. Mateo's hands fascinated me. Not elegant, not soft, but attentive, present. Hands that seemed to believe everything deserved patience. He noticed. My hands are nothing special, he said, looking down at them. They are, I said, surprising us both. They're honest. He held the word like something breakable. That spring unfolded in rituals we didn't know were rituals. Tuesdays, the gravel path from the herbs to the pond, debating whether plants felt emotion. Fridays, a shared cornetto from the cafe outside the gate, torn neatly in half, though one half was always a touch larger. Sundays, my sketches, his humming, always on vowels, never consonants, as if consonants required commitment he wasn't ready for. On our last afternoon, sitting on a cracked wooden bench near the pond, he brushed soil from his trousers and said, "Maybe, if we meet here 1 year from today, at noon, we can see who we've become." I laughed. Of course I laughed. When you're 26, spring turns everything poetic. You say things you don't mean, and mean things you don't say. I never marked the date. I never returned in 2000. I assume he hadn't meant it. We never spoke of it again, and then life, predictably, happened. 26 years later, I stepped through the garden gates like someone entering a former life on tiptoe. The air smelled the same, green and hopeful. I wasn't looking for Mateo. I told myself that several times. My feet, however, had motives. Near the old bench, I saw someone sitting alone. A man with silver hair, slightly stooped posture, a notebook open on his lap, humming, faintly, on vowels. My heart lurched, unprepared. I approached, pretending to be deeply invested in a shrub that did not deserve such devotion. He glanced up, polite, unreadable. I circled subtly, studying him from a safer angle. The way he held his pen, the angle of his head, the humming. But faces change over decades. Memory doesn't update its files. So I tried a different route. Language. "Excuse me," I said, in my clearest English. "Do you know if the garden still has the fig tree?" He turned, a pause, a blink, once, then again. The exact twice blink he used to do in 1999 whenever he was unsure or shy. "The fig tree," he repeated in English. He studied my face, as if trying to place a photograph he remembered loving. You look familiar," he said softly. "I think," I whispered, "we met once, a long time ago." His breath caught. "Liora." And there it was, the season I had tucked away like a pressed flower, opening again in the warmth. We sat on opposite ends of the bench, like two countries resuming diplomatic relations. He told me about his marriage, warm, steady, full of real life and Legos. His wife, Sophia, was a teacher. Their boys were loud and loved volcanoes. His life suited him. I told him about my daughter, my divorce, my basil plants, which refused to thrive no matter what motivational speech I gave them. We walked the garden paths, older now, quieter now. When we reached the far end, he stopped beside a tall fig tree. "This one," he said, touching the bark. "I planted it that spring. The sapling we had sat beneath in 1999. I placed my hand on a leaf. It quivered politely. Then he said, "About that next year, the day we said we would meet." I waited. "I went," he said. "Not at noon. I was late. I hoped you might still be there." Something fragile cracked inside me. "I didn't come," I whispered. "I thought you were being poetic or playful. I didn't think you meant it." He nodded, smiling gently. "I figured. I didn't blame you. Not then. Not now." We stood in the fig tree's shade, suddenly young again and older than ever. Sometimes you don't realize you were expected until someone forgives you for not arriving. As we started to walk back to the bench, Matteo paused, gazing back at the fig tree. Tall now, rooted and unapologetically alive. A single dried fig leaf lay on the ground near the trunk, curled slightly at the edges, its veins delicate as handwriting. He bent to pick it up. "This is a little silly," he said, sheepish, "but here." He held it out to me, thin, veined, beautifully fragile, a past season made harmless. I took it carefully, as though it might dissolve. Then, once we reached the bench, "Do you still have your sketchbook?" he asked. I did, the same one from 1999. He opened it carefully. When he turned a page, The sketch appeared, his hands drawn decades ago. He froze, a small, sharp inhale. "You kept this," he said quietly. "All these years." I nodded. He studied the drawing with a tenderness so earnest it felt like a confession. I didn't know," he murmured, "that I looked like that to you." Then he took the dried fig leaf from me and placed it on the page, aligning its thin veins with the curve of the drawn knuckles. "They belong together," he said. And somehow they did. When I returned to Bath, I unpacked slowly, as if each item carried traces of a season I was not ready to let settle. My sketchbook lay at the bottom of the suitcase, wrapped carefully in a sweater as though it were something breakable. I set it on the kitchen table and opened it to the page where the dried fig leaf rested against the drawing of Matteo's hands. They touched lightly, the leaf and the lines, as if recognizing each other across time. It occurred to me then that some things do not ask for preservation. They simply endure because the heart remembers where to place them. I sat there for a long while, listening to the house settle around me. The afternoon light stretched itself across the table, generous and unhurried. There was no drama in the moment, no triumph or sorrow, only a quiet knowing that felt older than I was. For years I had carried that sketch without understanding why. I think now it was because it held something truer than longing. It held regard, a deep, wordless regard for a person who moved through the world with gentleness, and for the younger self who had sensed the importance of that gentleness without yet having the language for it. Some people shape us not by staying, but simply by showing us what a softer way of living might feel like. I framed the page at last, not to enshrine a possibility, but to honor a moment that had done its small, quiet work in me. The leaf, the hand, the years between them, all of it part of the same unhurried mercy. Spring is generous that way. It returns not to erase what came before, but to remind us that growth is still possible, even now, even here, even after all this time. I opened the window, and the late afternoon drifted in, carrying that faint scent of damp earth. The world felt, for a moment, remarkably tender. And I understood, with a calm that surprised me, that I had not gone back to find Matteo at all. I had gone back to find the woman who once drew a pair of hands because she instinctively knew they were teaching her something about how to live. And she was still here, quietly, steadily, finally willing to listen. Before we continue, I want to gently remind you that this story is an imagined one, inspired by a real question but shaped with care. Names, details, and circumstances have been changed to protect privacy. What remains is the emotional truth, the part that mattered. In the conversation that follows, you'll hear from Liora, the woman who brought this what if to life, as we talk about what it meant to imagine a reunion that never happened, and why sometimes imagining is enough. Liora, what made you want to imagine this story in the first place?
I didn't want to reopen anything in real life. I wanted to visit it safely. I think I wrote to you because I'd carried this quiet question for so long. Not loudly, not painfully, just persistently. And I realized I wasn't actually wondering what would have happened romantically. I was wondering whether I'd misunderstood something important about myself back then. Imagining the reunion felt like a way to ask that question without asking anyone else to carry it for me.
When you imagine Matteo before the reunion, before the garden, how did he live in your memory? Not who he was exactly, but how he felt to remember.
He wasn't very clear visually. That surprised me. He was more like a sensation, like steadiness, warmth without urgency. I didn't remember his face very well, but I remembered his hands, which I know sounds strange, but it's true. He lived in my memory the way certain songs do. You don't remember all the lyrics, but your body knows when it's playing.
When you let yourself imagine seeing him again, stepping into that garden after all those years, what did you notice happening in your body?
Oh, panic. Immediate, unreasonable panic. Even though it wasn't real, my body reacted like it was. My heart sped up, my chest tightened, and then there was this quieter feeling underneath, like grief, but gentler. It wasn't sadness. It was the awareness that time had passed, properly passed, that I wasn't who I used to be, and neither was he.
There's a moment in the story that stayed with me. When you imagine learning that Matteo actually did go back to the bench a year later, and you didn't. When you sat with that idea, what did it bring up for you emotionally?
That took me a while. At first I felt embarrassed, I think. Not ashamed, just tenderly foolish. Like I'd missed the tone of a sentence decades ago and only just caught up. But then something else happened. I felt compassion. For him, for going, even imperfectly. And for myself, for not understanding yet how much quiet people sometimes mean what they say. I realized I wasn't cruel. I was young and very literal.
Did imagining that moment, the bench, the timing, the forgiveness, did it change the story you've been telling yourself all these years about that part of your life?
Yes, very quietly, but completely. I stopped seeing that time as a failure to arrive and started seeing it as a choice made with incomplete information, which is, honestly, how most of life works. That shift felt relieving, like putting something heavy down without realizing you'd been carrying it.
I want to talk about the drawing, Matteo's hands, and the fig leaf, because that feels like the emotional heart of the story. Why do you think that stayed with you all these years?
I think the drawing wasn't really about Matteo. It was about attention. He was the first person I remember watching closely, not because I wanted anything from him, but because the way he moved through the world felt instructive, gentle, unhurried, careful without being precious. The fig leaf, imagined or not, just completed that thought. It let me place that memory somewhere visible instead of carrying it around unnamed.
If you imagine the 26-year-old version of yourself now, you know, the one who laughed and thought the promise was just poetic, what do you want to say to her now?
Oh, I'd probably say, not everything that sounds light is unserious. And maybe, people mean things more often than you think, especially the quiet ones. But I wouldn't warn her too much. She needed to misunderstand a few things to become who she is now. Apparently, I did too.
When you allow yourself to imagine going back, not physically, not emotionally either, was there anything unexpected you came away with?
Relief. Which sounds small, but it isn't. Relief from the idea that I'd failed something important. I hadn't failed. I'd simply lived forward instead of backward. That realization was very kind.
You know, this podcast is built around what if stories. After writing yours, do you think those questions are meant to be answered?
I don't think they're meant to be answered. I think they're meant to be listened to. Like questions that soften with time instead of demanding conclusions. Some what-ifs aren't doors, they're windows. You don't climb through them. You just understand the view a little better.
And finally, after imagining all of this, after letting the story settle, what does spring mean to you now?
Permission. Not to start over, that's exhausting, but to notice again. To tend what's already here. To trust that growth doesn't require youth, just attention. And I think I finally have that.
Liora, thank you for trusting me and us with something imagined that turned out to be so real.
Thank you for giving it a place to land.
What I love most about this story is not the reunion. It's the permission it offers. Permission to be gentle with who we were. Permission to understand our younger selves, not as careless, but as unprepared, which is something very different. Some what-ifs aren't meant to be answered. They're meant to be held, examined, and then, if we're lucky, set down with kindness. If this story resonated with you, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast and stay with us a while. And if there's a conversation you never had, a question that still lingers quietly in you, I'd love to hear it. You can send your story requests to sayonemorethingpod@gmail.com. I'm Andrea Applewick, and this is If I Could Say One More Thing.